Greetings, my name is Chamomile and this is an exploration of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today, we're looking at Duro Sector and 2nd Green Mantle Command of the Southern Core. Duro Sector is one of the rare sectors whose name actually makes fucking sense. The capital is planet Duro, home of the Duro species, and most of the planets here are Duro's colonies, although Duro is the only major world left. Duro was a slave world of the Rakatan Infinite Empire, forced to help build the Starforge against their will. When a plague killed most of the genetically identical Rakata, the Duros finished off the survivors in and around their planet, reverse-engineered Rakatan hyperdrives, and adapted them to work without relying on the dark side of the Force as a power source. All Rakatan technology used the dark side as a power source because they had engineered themselves to be 100% Force-sensitive, and their Force tradition was totally immersed in the dark side, and making their technology reliant on the dark side meant that slave species couldn't learn to use it, except in the rare cases when they were Force-sensitive naturally. That genetic engineering made them vulnerable to the plague that killed them all. Some Rakatans were able to quarantine themselves, but precisely 0 of them were immune, because their genetics were basically identical. They were basically a whole civilization of inbred cousins, and their reliance on the dark side also introduced weaknesses into their technology. Rakatans could only travel to planets that were aligned with the dark side. Bis, Tatooine, Kashyyyk, Korriban, Manan, and Duro were all on the menu, but Coruscant, Tython, Ossus, Alderaan, Corellia, and Ryloth were not. When the Duros adapted the technology to work on mundane reactor fuel, they also removed the tech's biggest weakness. Without a reliance on the dark side, a hyperdrive could go anywhere. Strictly speaking, you don't even need a gravity well, as long as you've got extremely precise coordinates and a nav computer accurate to within a few hundred kilometers max, which, on the one hand, pretty much no one has those things, they're really hard, but on the other hand, it's at least theoretically possible in a way that it very much is not for Rakatan hyperdrives. The reliance on the dark side held the Rakatans back from ever truly ruling the galaxy, despite having economic and military power that eclipsed any nation during or after their time. They could conquer any species they could reach, but they could only reach a tiny handful of species. Once the Duros had hyperdrive tech, they made contact with a lot of nearby human worlds, which had been colonizing the galaxy with lightspeed generation ships for millennia. These ships accelerated to the speed of light and then made a centuries-long journey to relatively nearby star systems like Corellia, Anaxes, and Alderaan. Each ship was a full-sized city of hundreds of thousands of inhabitants, living in a self-contained biosphere that would simply become the planetary capital when they landed at their destination and opened up the airlocks. Once the Duros and their hyperdrive made contact with humans, they could get back in touch with the homeworld and other generation ship colonies in a matter of weeks. Hyperdrives really sucked back then, so it did take weeks, and cultures that had been out of contact with one another for millennia were suddenly thrust into a galactic community with one another, one built on the smoldering ruins of the Rakatans without even really realizing it. People knew from the Duros that the Rakatans existed, but did not understand the limitations of the dark side powered tech. The Duros had worked out alternative power sources because they're a normal species who have, at any given time, 1 or 2 Force users amongst their entire population tops. They didn't realize the drawbacks of the dark side power source. They thought Rakatan hyperdrives could go anywhere just like Duros hyperdrives, and just required a special power source that the Duros couldn't use. So the Rakatans were thought of as a regional power of similar scale to the Duro kingdom that had replaced it, and that most stories of their accomplishments were probably propaganda and myth, because if the Rakatans had never even reached nearby Corellia, then how powerful could they really be? It wasn't until pretty deep into the Old Republic era that archaeologists started reassessing the power of the Infinite Empire. The Duros followed the same trajectory as a lot of early Galactic Republic members, where initially the Republic was a pretty hands-off government. The power of the Senate over member planets was really small, so major planets wanted to be the capital of big sectors that were powerful unto themselves. The Republic called itself a single nation, but it was really more of a military alliance with an economic treaty. The sectors were deeply tied to one another politically and economically, but there were few enough of them back then that the agreements and treaties signed between sectors themselves, without going through the Senate to rope the whole Republic in, could be as or more important than Republic legislation. So the Duro Kingdom, as it was known back then, made itself really big with direct control over major colony worlds like Aquilae and Adapap. But by the middle of the early Republic era, the Republic had millions of sectors. The Duro Kingdom, Herglic Trade Empire, and Corellia could still get together and hash out an economic treaty between themselves, but the importance of even these major regional powers of the Southern Core were completely eclipsed by the galaxy-spanning influence of the Republic. Gradually, being a powerful sector that could make your own deals without Senate approval became a worse strategy as compared to being an alliance of several smaller sectors that could bring more votes to the Galactic Senate. So the Duro Kingdom sliced itself to pieces by setting up major colonies as sector capitals or as freestanding planets with individual Senate representation. Now, you may be wondering, how could the Republic have millions of sectors when it now, today, has barely 1 million inhabited worlds total? Answer: once it became beneficial to have more votes in the Senate rather than bigger individual sectors, major worlds started slicing themselves up into multiple sectors on a single planet. After all, if your colony world with one town and a population of less than 1 million is going to get a Senate seat, then surely, say, Kuwat with a population of 3.5 billion can have 3,500 Senate seats. I want to be totally clear here. I do not mean that Kuwat had a total of 3,500 one-town colony planets out in the colonies in Inner Rim and declared each one individually to be an independent government with its own sector, although they did also do that. I mean that there were 3,500 sectors on one planet! The Alsacan conflicts are a story for another time, but the way this gerrymandering totally paralyzed the Senate is one of the reasons behind them. The Republic was so completely non-functional as a governing body that Alsacan basically declared it defunct and started ignoring Senate legislation, daring them to actually pass a law reaffirming that it was illegal to blow up Duros freighters for entering Alsacan colonial space. The Senate couldn't do it. Coruscant's planetary government unilaterally, illegally commanded the Republic Navy to respond, and the Navy did it because the Senate had become a joke, so no one cared if the Navy was technically breaking Senate law. By the end of the first 5 Alsacan conflicts, the big ones, there were some reasonably sane standards applied to what could or could not be declared a sector. By then, the Duro Kingdom was basically just one planet, and also had changed its name to the Duro Sector as monarchies started to fall out of favor across the Republic, in no small part because Alsacan was aristocratic and had started the Alsacan conflicts by blowing up Duros freighters. Alsacan was also pretty humanocentric, so a lot of alien species turned their backs on monarchies in this era. By the time of the Old Republic era, planet Duro had been poisoned to the point of being basically completely inhospitable. You can still breathe down there, and a few people even live down there, but the vast majority of the planet lives in giant orbital megacities. There's 20 orbital cities containing over 90% of the planet's population, so the average population of each megacity is somewhere in the hundreds of millions. They're massive. Being aliens means that the Duros did not have a good time under the Pius Dea or the Empire, and in fact the Empire combined them with the Corellian sector to minimize their influence in the Senate. This was part of the reorganization of the Republic into the Empire before the Clone Wars were even completely over, so the Empire was still pretending to be a continuation of the Republic's tradition of sentient rights and individual liberty, which is why the Duros could still vote for a senator and were even pretty well represented by Garm Bel Iblis of Corellia. Corellians were friends with the Duros, despite the way they treated all the other aliens in their sector, so they weren't handed over to a cruel overlord the way some of the less popular alien species were, the ones that the Empire could grind under their heel without anyone in the core worlds getting angry enough to firebomb a police station over it. Although, I mean, the Empire was probably hoping the Corellians would do some heel grinding to the Duros, considering the way they treated most of the other alien species in the Corellian sector. But there were huge protests on Corellia the day of the reorganization. The Corellians hated the Empire. At this early stage, the Emperor wasn't removing the Duros from public life completely, but he was combining 2 troublesome sectors into one troublesome sector with only 1 vote in the Senate. Rebels tried to liberate Duro in the immediate aftermath of Yavin, when Outer Rim worlds were rising up in open rebellion against the Empire. Duro and Corellia were powerful worlds, deeply sympathetic to the rebellion, and pretty damn close to Coruscant. But this also made them a high priority for the Empire to keep control of, and the attempted uprising was quickly crushed. Duro would even go on to be a holdout planet of Green Mantle after they mostly surrendered to the New Republic after the Battle of Jakku. There were a lot of Imperial holdouts in the core and Inner Rim right after the New Republic was declared on Coruscant, and the New Republic split up their fleet to send ships in all directions to bring these planets into the New Republic. But the ships weren't all that necessary on Duro, which was surrounded by friendly planets and had a deeply anti-Imperial population. The holdout garrison there did not last long. You will not be surprised to learn that the reorganization of Corellia and Duro into one sector was reversed, and Duro once again has independent representation in the Galactic Senate of the New Republic.